What up, y'all? Welcome to Marx in the House. This is a video series where we talk about gentrification and housing from a Marxist perspective. Today is an exciting day because we're finally gonna look at gentrification in practice. Well, okay, I don't know if exciting is the right word, but anyhow, let's take a look at the gentrification of the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Now remember, what do we need for classic gentrification to happen? We need disinvestment of an area, but disinvestment implies previous investment, right? I mean, capital can't leave an area without having been there in the first place. Cool. So let's see how this plays out for Manhattan. Can't afford rent, getting gentrified. Marx in the house, about to tell you why. Like any city in the US, the construction of New York is drenched in blood. First through the colonial genocide, replacement, and displacement of the Lenape people. Then through the slave labor that actually constructed the city. It's simply not enough to say that construction capital formed the first layer of investment in Manhattan. Because remember, capital operates within a social context, and in the US, it's that of settler colonialism. The Lower East Side in particular at first was filled with rich white people. They moved out, and working class black, brown, and white, predominantly Jewish people moved in. As New York grew throughout the 20th century, more and more capital started to be pumped into Manhattan, except for the Lower East Side. This means that the land value of the Lower East Side rose because of all the investment in land adjacent to it, but no actual capital was invested there. In fact, the Lower East Side became the poorest area in Manhattan outside of Harlem. Now, you might have a couple of people who notice a juicy rent gap has opened up, who make the initial investment. But then, of course, those people who have made the initial investment want more and more investors to flood the neighborhood. At the same time, it's in the interest of the local government for more investors to come in so they can make more sweet tax dollars. So now it's up to them to make the area more attractive for investment. Now, how do you make a neighborhood more attractive? Art. The old Trojan horse of gentrification. Now, this is exactly what happened in the Lower East Side. It might be happening in your neighborhood right now. Landlords kept rent on the low in the early 80s to attract artists. Because you know artists stay broke. Most of these landlords were just anonymous management companies, which shows how much they're actually invested in, where people actually fucking live. A lot of up-and-coming artists moved to the Lower East Side, collaborated together, and worked with the art galleries there. This made the neighborhood poppin' and gave it the aura of good location. Now, aura is an important word here because materially, people were still living in shitty, underfunded cribs. Real estate people love talking about good location, and in this capitalist hellhole, art equals good location. Good location increases the land value. It's a real estate package deal and requires barely any capital investment, which is why we see it happening everywhere. After this marketing campaign was complete, all landlords had to do was to increase the rent to force the artists out. The ones who didn't make it at least, which in this system is almost everybody. So yes, in this neighborhood the artists were the first wave of gentrifiers. Whether they were conscious of the cycle of displacement they were supporting doesn't really matter. We need to look at the material effects of people's actions instead of intent. Another important point is that gentrification works in cycles of displacement. Like I said, the artists were the first wave of gentrifiers. But after they did their job and upped the land value, rent got jacked up, artists got kicked the fuck out, and a new cycle of capital flushed in. And after the labor aristocracy moves in, a new cycle of capital flushes in and replaces them with the upper petty bourgeoisie, and so on. So two things are true. There are cycles of gentrification that screw over people who inhabit different class positions. But at the same time, the most burden and violence falls on working class people. And since the bourgeoisie loves to segregate on black and brown people. Remember kids, it's not just capitalism, it's also colonialism. So what else can we learn from the gentrification of the Lower East Side? Well, it's the land value that determines capital movement and not the buildings on the land. If there's shitty buildings in a neighborhood, capitalists will want to invest if the land value is high. And it doesn't go the other way around. If there's sparkly new buildings and the land value is shit, then I will take my capital elsewhere. Good day. Let's take the Chrisadora Building as an example. Built in 1928 as a settlement house, it was sold to the city of New York in 1947 for $1.3 million. After capital flight from the area, it was used as a community center and, interestingly enough, housed Black Panthers and Young Lords. After the building was run down in the late 60s, no one wanted to buy it at a 1975 auction. Why? Too risky of an investment. The rent gap wasn't big enough yet. It was later sold for $62,500 to a Brooklyn developer. In 1980, the area started to slowly become more poppin'. Remember, artists were flushing in and raising land values. Just based on this increase in land value, he started to get offers for the building for $800,000. He eventually sold it for $1.3 million in 1983 and would later be sold for $3 million. Mind you, nobody had done shit to this building all this time. It was the land value that fluctuated up and down, which was determined by what? Yes sir, capital movement. It's a domino effect. This sparked off speculation all across the area. This of course has whole ass material effects on people. The Orchidea, an Italian-Ukrainian restaurant on the Lower East Side, had to close and get the fuck out because the landlord raised the rent from $950 to $5,000 overnight. Let's do one more quick example. At 270 East 10th Street, the combined sale price of the building and land went from $5,706 to $202,600 in 5.5 years, while the value of the building actually fell from $26,000 to $18,000. The land was that much more valuable than the building. Point taken? Cool. Then let's take it a step further. Think about what this process means. The value of this building decreased, which means there weren't any repairs done. The owners and developers pocketed that money, while the people living there were fucked. With the value of the building decreasing and the land value increasing, a juicy rent gap was established. Meaning whoever was able to charge rent was about to be able to charge a whole fucking lot. So first the owners profited from pocketing rent without making any repairs. This means they held back capital. Because they held back capital, they created a situation in which they could reinvest capital. They made money from disinvestment and then from reinvestment. But is this how the media portrays it? No! People like this are labeled as heroes by the news for investing in an area that no one else dared to invest in. And that's gentrification, folks. It's the difference between capitalized ground rent, which means how much money you're getting from rent, and potential ground rent, how much rent you could be getting if you were using the land to its highest and best use. Of course we live in capitalism, so the highest and best use means whatever makes the most profit. There's an empty condo that's worth $5 million. Capitalism would say that the land has fully capitalized its potential ground rent. But to the houseless person almost freezing to death on the street, that seems ironic to say the least. Under communism, the highest and best use of land relates to the needs of the people, as well as self-determination for repressed nations. But all this is relative. If there's a condo that charges $5,000 for rent, but potentially there's people willing to pay $10,000 in rent, there's still a rent gap. The potential ground rent would not have been capitalized. And that's the madness of the capitalist system. This was Marx in the House. Friendly reminder to everybody that if you're watching this on stolen land, then anti-gentrification cannot be separated from the decolonial struggle. And it's up to us to turn these empty platitudes into concrete political programs. Next week, we're going to take a look at gentrification in Harlem. Peace, space baby.